The big boy was one of the largest and most powerful steam locomotives ever built, a 600-ton giant designed to conquer mountain grades that broke ordinary engines. Only 25 were ever made, and when the age of steam ended, almost all of them were marked for the same fate, the scrapyard. But one of these legends survived, not because someone fought to save it, not because of its history, but because of a single, almost laughable, clerical error. This is the story of how a piece of misfiled paperwork accidentally became the most important document in American railroad preservation. At the start of the 1940s, the Union Pacific Railroad faced a massive operating bottleneck in the American West. The steep, punishing grades of the Wasatch Range in Utah and Sherman Hill in Wyoming required multiple locomotives to move heavy transcontinental freight trains. Splitting trains or coupling extra helper engines to the front and back of these loads at the base of the mountains was slow, expensive, and logistically difficult. The railroad needed a single locomotive powerful enough to haul a 6,000-ton train up a continuous 1.5% mountain grade without any assistance. To solve this demanding operating challenge, Union Pacific commissioned a new class of steam power from the American Locomotive Company known as ALCO in Schenectady, New York. The designers at ALCO responded with an engineering giant, a simple articulated steam locomotive utilizing a 4884 wheel arrangement. It was a machine designed strictly for brutal, heavy-duty industrial service. The physical scale of this new class was unprecedented. From coupler to coupler, the locomotive and its tender stretched over 132 feet. The entire assembly weighed more than 1.2 million pounds in active service, carrying driving wheels that measured 68 inches in diameter to balance raw pulling power with a top speed of 80 miles per hour. Each driving axle carried approximately 68,000 pounds of load, the highest axle load placed on any North American mainline track at that time. To feed steam to 4 massive cylinders, the boiler operated at 300 pounds per square inch of pressure, generating a starting tractive effort of over 138,000 pounds. To clear the tight curves of the mountain passes, the frame utilized a massive articulated joint, allowing the front engine unit to pivot independently, while the rear unit remained rigid under the boiler. ALCO delivered the first 20 locomotives between 1941 and 1942, followed by a final order of 5 in 1944. These 25 engines made up the entire class. They went straight to work, pulling heavy military and commercial tonnage through the high plains. At the time of their construction, Union Pacific viewed these machines strictly as practical, disposable tools designed to solve an immediate mechanical problem. They were built to work, to wear out, and eventually to be retired. The designation 4884 describes the physical arrangement of the locomotive's wheels, a sequence that dictated its performance on mountain passes. At the front, a 4-wheel leading truck guided the engine into tight curves. Behind it sat 2 independent sets of 8 driving wheels, each group powered by its own pair of steam cylinders. A 4-wheel trailing truck supported the weight of the large firebox. This arrangement provided an expansive area of contact with the rails, distributing the weight to maximize adhesion and prevent the driving wheels from slipping on steep, wet mountain tracks. At a scale of nearly 600 tons, a rigid locomotive of this length was structurally impossible for mainline service. It would have derailed on the sharp curves of the Wasatch Range, or physically spread the tracks apart. To bypass this limitation, the engineering team employed articulation. The frame was split into 2 distinct engine units connected by a heavy steel hinge called the articulation tongue joint. The rear engine remained fixed to the boiler, while the front engine pivoted independently. This allowed the long machine to clear curves with a radius as tight as 288 feet, bending as it climbed the mountain passes. The articulation tongue joint bore immense physical loads, with the rear engine unit pushing down with about 14,000 pounds of force to maintain stability. This mechanical layout allowed Union Pacific to move 6,000-ton freight trains over steep grades without stopping to couple helper engines. On a 1.5% grade, standard locomotives would stall, or their wheels would spin uselessly on the steel rails. The 4884 design solved this by combining the pulling force of two separate engines into a single frame, managed by a single crew. The boiler supplied steam through flexible pipes to all four cylinders, keeping the heavy machine moving forward at a steady pace. Every component, from the placement of the driving axles to the engineering of the articulated joint, served as a direct response to the geography of the Rocky Mountains. The design was a purely functional solution to an immediate operating obstacle, built to keep the transcontinental supply lines moving without delay. On the high-altitude division between Cheyenne, Wyoming, and Ogden, Utah, these 25 locomotives became the absolute backbone of Union Pacific's transcontinental line. They were not kept clean for exhibitions or treated as engineering novelties. They were muddy, soot-caked machines that worked 24 hours a day. Out on the line, the human crews operating them faced some of the most unforgiving railroading territory in North America. In the sub-zero winters of the mountain passes, steam condensation could instantly freeze coal to the tender walls, and heavy snows threatened to stall any train that lost momentum. Inside the cab, survival and speed depended entirely on the raw power under the boiler. Firemen watched the mechanical stoker feed up to 22 tons of coal per hour into a firebox that burned at temperatures exceeding 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit. Engineers monitored the water glasses and managed the heavy throttle, feeling the massive frame flex beneath them as they guided thousands of tons of freight up the Wasatch grades. Lighter locomotives frequently slipped their drivers or stalled entirely on these slopes, but the 4884 class kept moving, maintaining a steady 20 miles per hour. Where other steam engines failed, the legend of the Big Boy was not born in a museum or written by publicists. It was earned by ordinary railroaders who relied on the giant's 138,000 pounds of tractive effort to bring wartime freight, steel, and coal over the Continental Divide. For nearly 2 decades, these machines proved their utility in daily grueling service, becoming the indispensable workhorses of the American West. The end of the steam era did not arrive because the big boys failed, but because they were too magnificent to survive a changing balance sheet. In the years following the Second World War, the American railroad network faced a brutal economic realignment. The massive industrial infrastructure required to support steam power, including the coal docks, water treatment facilities, ash disposal pits, and armies of skilled boilermakers, had become an unsustainable financial burden. Steam locomotives spent too much time in the maintenance shops, requiring constant work to keep their boilers safe and their moving parts lubricated. A different technology, quiet and utilitarian, was ready to take its place. The diesel-electric locomotive offered a simpler, cleaner, and cheaper operating model. While a steam engine like the Big Boy required hours of preheating, constant water stops, and intensive mechanical inspections after every run, diesel units could start instantly. They ran thousands of miles with minimal servicing, burning oil with far greater thermal output per dollar than coal. Diesels could also be linked together under the control of a single crew, matching or exceeding the pulling power of a steam giant, without the specialized labor force. For Union Pacific, the choice was entirely a matter of business survival, free of sentiment. By the late 1950s, the railroad initiated a rapid, system-wide push toward complete dieselization. The massive 4000 series locomotives, designed to be the ultimate solutions to the mountain passes, were suddenly expensive liabilities. They spent less time on the main line and more time sitting idle in the yards. bypassed by fleets of standardized diesel units. The final revenue season for the big boys took place in July 1959, when a handful of the engines made their last trips between Cheyenne and Laramie. After that, the fires were extinguished. By 1962, Union Pacific had completely withdrawn steam from active service. The world's largest locomotives, built to work for decades, were suddenly obsolete. In a matter of years, these triumphs of American engineering went from irreplaceable assets to millions of pounds of redundant steel, waiting silently in storage tracks for their final disposition. The transition from active machinery to industrial scrap followed a highly organized, bureaucratic pipeline. In the early 1960s, the mechanical department clerks and accounting staff at Union Pacific's Cheyenne, Laramie, and Green River offices began systematically processing the 25 big boy locomotives. Each giant was handled individually, stripped of its operational identity, and converted into a line item on yard lists. These documents dictated the exact sequence of destruction. Locomotives were routed through rigid disposition categories, some marked for temporary storage, some for parts stripping, and the vast majority destined for immediate metal reclamation. From a corporate standpoint, a retired big boy was no longer a triumph of engineering. It was 600 tons of high-grade industrial inventory. With a combined engine and tender weight exceeding 1.2 million pounds, each locomotive represented an immense concentration of valuable materials. The massive steel boilers, heavy cast iron frames, and extensive copper piping made these machines highly attractive to commercial scrappers. At contemporary scrap metal prices, a single big boy could yield substantial revenue for a railroad looking to balance its sheets during a costly transition to diesel power. To harvest this value, the railroad relied on a tightly managed administrative system. Clerks filled out standardized retirement packets, including Form 48R, the official retirement order. This paperwork required precise entries, including yardmaster signatures, clerical status codes, and specific check marks to authorize the transfer of these massive assets to the scrapyard. Once the forms were processed, shop crews at the Cheyenne yard moved the designated locomotives to the cutting tracks. There, workers equipped with heavy oxyacetylene torches systematically cut the boilers, drivers, and frames into manageable sections for transport to steel mills. This was a routine, highly systematic manufacturing process in reverse. The administrative machinery moved with clinical precision, tracking every pound of metal to ensure nothing was lost or overlooked. Each completed form and signed register was a death warrant, slowly shrinking the surviving fleet as one engine after another was reduced to molten steel. The system was designed to be absolute, leaving no room for sentimentality or oversight. Union Pacific's system for dismantling its steam fleet depended on a rigid, highly structured paper trail. When a locomotive's service life ended, its physical journey to the cutting torch began not with a mechanic's assessment, but with a clerk typing out a standardized form. The primary instrument of condemnation was Form 48R, the official retirement order. This single sheet of paper acted as the legal death warrant for a 600-ton machine, initiating an irreversible chain of custody designed to track every ounce of steel from the rails to the furnace. Tracing a locomotive through this administrative pipeline requires following a sequence of tightly synchronized documents. A clerk first prepared Form 48R, filling in the locomotive's road number, its accumulated mileage, and most importantly, checking the designated box marking the asset for scrap. Once prepared, the form required the physical signature of the local yardmaster, verifying that the engine was present and ready for disposition. Once signed, the retirement order triggered a wave of secondary paperwork. The yardmaster issued orders to switch crews, who updated the daily yard logs as they shoved the dead engine onto the storage tracks. Meanwhile, the accounting department logged the transfer in the Union Pacific Scrapyard Transfer Register, a master ledger managed by the scrap division that authorized the commercial cutting crews to begin their work. For the system to work without error, these documents had to match perfectly. Internal memos, yard logs, and roundhouse inventory logs served as constant checks, verifying whether the corporate paperwork and physical reality still matched. Every morning, inventory clerks walked the tracks with clipboards, verifying that the physical locomotives sitting in the Cheyenne yard matched the active line items on the scrap manifests. If an engine was moved to the cutting tracks, a transfer slip had to be signed. If a boiler was sliced open, the scrap tonnage was weighed, recorded, and cross-referenced against the original retirement order. This chain of custody was designed to be airtight, leaving no room for a half-million-pound machine to simply wander off or be forgotten. The entire process operated with the cold, predictable efficiency of an assembly line in reverse. Yet the very complexity of this paper network created a hidden vulnerability. On July 15, 1961, clerk R.C. Harlan sat at a typewriter in the Union Pacific office in Cheyenne, preparing Form 48R for locomotive number 4014. This standard retirement order was designed to strip the engine of its operational status and authorize its destruction. The process required a single, routine action: typing a check mark inside the small column marked scrap. Harlan left that box blank. Instead of the standard scrap designation, the paperwork received a handwritten internal code in the margin, DONHLD, representing a temporary donation hold. This was a common administrative marker, used to pause a locomotive's demolition while the railroad evaluated potential donation requests from municipal parks or museums. It was never intended as a permanent exemption. When Yardmaster J.W. Hubbard signed the bottom of the form, he signed a document that lacked the explicit command to send the engine to the cutting tracks. This omission created an immediate contradiction inside the documents. When the retirement package arrived at the accounting department, clerks did not interpret the DONHLD code as a temporary pause. Instead, they mistook it for a completed transaction, processing the locomotive as if the donation had already been finalized by the general office. On paper, the 600-ton machine was transferred to a preservation category, bypassing the standard demolition pipeline entirely. This type of misclassification, misplaced order, or wrong column entry was a constant risk within an overloaded paper archive. In the case of number 4014, the administrative system worked against itself. By August 5, 1961, when scrapyard manager L.R. Miller compiled the Master Scrapyard Transfer Register, locomotive 4014 was completely absent from the list. While its sister engines were systematically towed to the cutting tracks, number 4014 remained parked. The demolition crews, equipped with oxyacetylene torches, worked strictly from the approved register, destroying only the locomotives that appeared on their active manifests. Because of a blank box and a misread code, the giant engine had become invisible to the scrapyard. It sat quietly in the Cheyenne yard, recorded on daily inventory logs by clerk E.M. Kelly as retained pending assignment. The locomotive survived not through a deliberate act of preservation, but because it had simply ceased to exist on the company's execution list. During the late summer and autumn of 1961, the physical reality in the Cheyenne yard began to split along a sharp administrative line. The standard retirement pipeline moved forward with mechanical certainty. In September, shop crews hooked up the heavy cutting torches to dismantle locomotive 4015, making it the very first big boy to be systematically reduced to scrap. Soon after, locomotives 4011, 4000, and 4003 were shoved onto the cutting tracks. The roar of 2,500-degree fires inside the active boilers was replaced by the blinding glare of oxyacetylene, slicing through steel boilers, heavy cast-iron frames, and massive driving wheels. Work crews weighed the harvested tonnage, logging the scrap metal against the original retirement orders to ensure every ounce of the assets was accounted for. The valuable metal was then loaded onto flat cars and shipped to commercial steel mills, bringing the railroad much-needed revenue. Yet on a parallel track just yards away, locomotive 4014 sat in absolute silence. Daily switch crews worked the yard, coupling dead engines and routing them to the scrap line, but they repeatedly bypassed the silent giant. The crews operated strictly by the daily scrap manifests. If a road number was not on the paper list, the physical locomotive remained untouched. Because of the blank box on Form 48R, the engine existed in a state of suspended animation. The daily roundhouse logs simply recorded the engine as retained, an administrative status that insulated the physical machine from the cutting torches. This divergence was entirely unacknowledged at the time. There were no preservationists standing guard, no corporate directives to save the engine, and no public campaigns. The physical survival of the machine was dictated entirely by a mismatch between the document trail and the physical yard. Number 4014 remained whole not through an act of heroism, but because it had slipped into an administrative blind spot. This mismatch was not a strategic plan. It was a bureaucratic vacuum. The gap between the paperwork and the physical outcome became a quiet, invisible shield. While 17 of its sister engines were systematically broken down and melted into history, this single 600-ton Titan stood undisturbed, preserved by the quiet oversight of an empty checkbox. On December 7, 1961, Union Pacific formally transferred ownership of locomotive 4014 to the Southern California chapter of the Railway and Locomotive Historical Society. It arrived at the Rail Giants Train Museum in Pomona, California on January 8, 1962. For the next 52 years, the 600-ton machine sat on an isolated stretch of track, surrounded by palm trees and fairgrounds. This early preservation was not a planned monument to steam engineering, but static custody. The engine was safe from the cutting torch, yet it remained dormant, a giant locked in place while the world changed around it. As the decades passed, the world of American railroading changed completely. The coal towers and water columns vanished from the main lines, and the steam era slipped entirely into historical memory. But this passage of time steadily transformed the locomotive's meaning. What had once been discarded as obsolete heavy-duty industrial waste slowly became a priceless artifact of American history. Rarity turned a corporate mistake into a historic treasure, and the very scale of the engine made it a symbol of an industrial golden age. By the early 21st century, Union Pacific began looking to its own heritage to celebrate the upcoming anniversary of the Transcontinental Railroad. The railroad's management realized that the clerical error of 1961 had kept an intact masterpiece within reach, waiting in the California sun. On July 23, 2013, Union Pacific announced a formal agreement with the museum to reacquire locomotive 4014. The railroad's dedicated steam team moved the locomotive back to the Cheyenne Heritage Shop, launching a massive multi-year restoration to return the machine to operational life on the main line. This milestone completed the transition from accidental survival to deliberate stewardship. Yet the story of this engine reveals the fragile contingency of history. We often assume that what we preserve is the result of vision and foresight. But the survival of this 600-ton Titan proves that sometimes the memory of an entire era of human achievement does not depend on grand designs. Instead, it can hinge on the quiet mercy of an unchecked box, a misfiled ledger, and a single forgotten piece of paper. In the Cheyenne Heritage Shop, the Union Pacific Steam Team began the monumental task of taking the 600-ton machine completely apart. Workers stripped number 4014 down to its bare steel frame, removing thousands of individual components to inspect, clean, and rebuild them. Heavy shop cranes lifted the massive 250-ton boiler from the chassis, exposing the articulated frame and the complex linkages underneath. Every single boiler tube was removed and replaced. Members of the Boilermakers Local 34 union crew spent months cutting out and replacing worn steel sheets inside the massive firebox, installing hundreds of new flexible stay bolts to secure the inner and outer boiler walls. They used non-destructive ultrasonic testing to measure the thickness of the original boiler shell, verifying that the steel could still handle extreme operating pressure. Because coal-fired operations are logistically difficult on the modern rail network, the restoration team modified the locomotive's fuel system. They converted the firebox to burn number 5 fuel oil, replacing the mechanical coal stoker with an oil burner and rebuilding the tender to hold fuel oil instead of coal. This technical choice solved the difficult problem of fueling and ash disposal during future long-distance runs. The tender, now holding 25,000 gallons of water and over 6,000 gallons of fuel oil, had its 14 wheels and axles fully reconditioned to support the massive load. While the boiler work proceeded, mechanics focused on the heavy running gear. They turned the 68-inch driving wheels on massive shop lathes to restore their perfect profile, and rebuilt the Walschaerts valve gear with newly machined pins and bushings. The team gave special attention to the massive articulation tongue joint, the essential hinge connecting the front and rear engine units. The joint had to be perfectly aligned to handle the 14,000 pounds of downward force exerted by the boiler and frame during tight curves. By late 2018, the thousands of refurbished parts began to come back together. The team lowered the boiler back onto the frames, carefully lining up the pivot bearings and securing the flexible steam pipes that feed the 4 massive cylinders. Then came the rigorous testing phase. Inspectors filled the boiler with water and pressurized it to verify its structural integrity before lighting the first fire in May 2019. When the boiler pressure reached its operating limit of 300 pounds per square inch, number 4014 moved under its own steam for the first time in 60 years. The successful test run completed the return of the locomotive from a static, forgotten museum piece back into an operating machine. When number 4014 rolled out of the Cheyenne shop, it was officially the only operating big boy in existence. Today, as the locomotive pulls excursions across the high plains, the ground-shaking roar of its exhaust and the smell of hot oil provide a sensory link to the peak of American steam power. The machine is no longer just a preserved object sitting behind a fence. It is a functioning, breathing representative of a vanished industrial age. By returning to the rails, number 4014 changed its survival from a passive historical accident into an active, living experience for hundreds of thousands of people. Today, this 600-ton titan still roars across the American landscape. Yet, its thunder is merely the echo of a forgotten clerical error. We believe we curate our history with deliberate care, but survival is often just an accident of ink. What other monuments of human genius have we lost to the quiet efficiency of a perfect filing system? If you enjoyed this journey, consider subscribing.